This is a show for grown-ups.
And they say bad words.
And they say bad words.
Say final warning.
Final warning.
Hello and welcome to the Pot of Blunders. I'm here with Bosch. How the hell are you?
You know, I'm doing pretty well this evening. I've had some actually fun online meetings today. Usually my online meetings are a lot more mundane than that. So yeah, today I'm in good spirits. Thanks for asking. How the hell are you?
I've never been better in my life. This is the pinnacle, and everything else will be downhill from here.
Well, I'm glad I get to be here to witness this moment.
So, right off the bat, what got you into game design?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things. It's one of those things, I don't know if you've had this experience where you sort of backtrack and start recontextualizing more things from your past as being about game design than you initially imagined were about game design. Because I think if I wanted to track it as absurdly far back as possible, I'd probably say it was all of the children's theater that I did. And just getting a really, really early love of being a character and being in character and seeing how that felt. And especially like, I was a pretty tiny kid and also gender nonconforming, but didn't really know that that's what I was doing because people don't tell a 4-year-old, you shouldn't do that. It's gender nonconforming. They just get sort of puzzled. And as a 4-year-old, you're not sure what's going on always, especially if your parents are very chill hippies. But we had a family friend who did a bunch of children's theater productions. And so starting around age 4, going till when I was around 14, I was in some kind of performance project at least once a year, most years. So I learned to love public speaking, love learning the sort of like stagecraft rules and systems in terms of engagement, and did a lot of improv games and collaborating with others. So I wrote little plays and got ideas for that. And I look back on that and I'm like, oh, that was kind of my baby game design ideas because that flowed so well into how I found game design. Because the other dimension of how I think I moved towards it was that my parents are lovely, weird hippies who raised me largely without TV, not as like a big intentional moral thing. It wasn't forbidden. They just didn't care about it very much. And so we didn't have one for a long time. But what they did have was a ton of indie 1980s comics. And when I was 15, they said, these aren't all age appropriate for you, but we trust you to figure out which ones are and which ones aren't because we don't want to have to sort through all these boxes. They are now open to you and set me loose. And I devoured everything I could find. And that also just got me more interested in comics in general. And then I was on the internet and there were web comics. And there were like 10 billion of those to explore. And through the circuitous routes of that, by the time I was starting undergrad in my late teens, I ran into a number of webcomic artists who were, you know, doing projects and collaborations with other people. And a couple of them were guests on a podcast called the One Shot Podcast, where they played a goofy 3-player romance game set at a wizard school. And I went, oh, I'll listen to that. It has creators I like in it. And then I went, holy shit, I don't entirely know what this is, but I want to learn more about this. And then I started listening to all of these different episodes of like one-shot playable RPGs. And that led me down a bunch of lovely rabbit holes. And then I started getting my friends to play things with me. And yeah, it just kept cascading. I'm giving you a very long answer. You're getting kind of the full timeline. But there's a lot of steps, and I like the ways that it weaves in because yeah, theater was an initial point, and then comics were an initial point. And then throughout the course of school, I gradually realized that what I wanted to do and where I was aiming myself was to work in education. And my graduate program was very cool and very weird because I spent most of it living on an island off the coast of Washington, working at an outdoor education center and taking courses at the same time. So it was a lot of learning by doing. And some of the training for that was essentially LARPing. We did a lot of active scenario games and role play as students and as teachers to figure out what we would do and how we would support kids in their learning in this very non-standard kind of education space. And also, I was living on an island with all of my grad classmates. I don't drive or have a car. I got kind of stuck feeling and really desperate to find ways and reasons to get into Seattle. And so I went to Emerald City Comic Con And while I was there, I played some one-shot RPGs, and one of the game facilitators there connected me with an in-person rotating one-shot gaming group that met at a comic and game store. And I started taking a bus and then a ferry and then another bus
Oh my God.
into Seattle a couple of times a month so that I could go play RPGs and just see people who I wasn't in a master's program with, because I needed that very badly for my brain. And then that group spun off, and through that, I met people who weren't just interested in playing these games, they were writing them. And sometimes they'd bring their own games to try out, or invite people from the group to meet up on other occasions or chat online to brainstorm game ideas. And so now I kind of have like an extended social circle that's full of game designers. And once that happens, it just starts cascading. So now I know a lot of the people on Twitter especially who are trans and also make small indie RPGs. Even if we haven't talked a bunch, I know a lot of names and faces because it's a richly communicative circle where lots of people share cool things. But there's not that many of us in practice. So often when I find out about a new person, I'm like, oh, I probably know people who know you. I just hadn't run into you specifically yet. But yeah, it's been a long journey, but it's a lot of just a cascade of, I love brainstorming weird creative ideas and telling stories with people. And pretty much every time I've found a way to do that, I've been very into that. And it used to be that theater was the main way I did that. And right now it is game design, and frankly, also teaching and education work. And the skill sets, especially from game design and working with elementary age kids, have fed each other a lot in my experience of how I run and write games and how I work with students.
So you're a real unicorn in terms of how you came to game design and even role-playing games. Like, you didn't start with the big, 5e or anything.
No,
You were,
I didn't.
Left
I've
field
played
entirely.
it.
Yeah.
I've played it, but that is 100% not how I learned about what RPGs were. The first game designer whose work I fell in love with was Avery Alder.
Oh,
The
yeah.
first game
All right.
that I ever facilitated was GM-less. I ran Dream Askew at my birthday party, and like the old version of it before
Right.
it was a nice print book, back when it was like a free PDF. Yeah.
That's a hell of a game, though. I mean, what a
It
good
is.
introduction to have to role-playing games.
It really it informed a lot of what I do, and yeah, especially some of Avery's work definitely has influenced some of the stuff that I've written.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yes. Knowing that about you now and seeing the games that you've created, I completely understand.
Yeah, the threads and through lines are not very subtle. Yeah, like the game that Avery co-wrote with, I don't know the actual name of the person she co-wrote it with because they used a pseudonym for it, but Avery and Anne Sheep's game, A Place to Fuck Each Other, which is a game I love but have trouble introducing people to because of the name sometimes, because it is not meant to be a suggestion. I just genuinely like playing the game. That and Downfall are two of the games that I've drawn from the most in some of my writing, because they both use what I think Avery has called character non-monogamy, where you design a character singularly or collaboratively with other players, and then you don't constantly play one character. You rotate player control of one or more characters. Because in A Place to Fuck Each Other, you create an ever-expanding, interlaced cast of queer women who date and socialize and are awkwardly socially enmeshed with each other, even when they're not dating. And the game is designed to let you get different tonal snippets of their lives at different points in time, and rotate lots of characters in and out of scenes. And then Downfall, of course, has 3 central characters representing 3 different tonalities, and you get to play one of them in a scene until everyone's played each one in each scene. And I 100% just grabbed that and ran with it when I wrote This Party Sucks, which is to date the largest of the games that I've written. I'm like, 1 protagonist, 3 players, everyone plays the protagonist once, and when you're not the protagonist, you are scene setting or playing the other characters in scene. So you build a character together, and then you are all that character, but in turns.
Let's talk about This Party Sucks, because it's a fascinating game.
Thank
because
you.
It explores a very unique perspective that doesn't get discussed a lot in role-playing games for stupid reasons. So, tell me about that game.
Yeah, it's a thing. I like the way you introed it too, because sort of the immediate shorthand of This Party Sucks is it is a game for 3 players, GM-less, where you collaboratively play a queer and or trans 20-something who is badly processing a recent breakup. That's the elevator pitch. And in practice, how it came to be was when the sort of itch.io game jam explosion happened after the initial like emotional mech jam got so big and cascaded across Twitter, and then that boosted the excitement and the sense of how to use itch.io for game jams for role-playing games. I participated in a game jam called Record Collection, where the premise was you write a game based on a song or an album of music, and there were additional challenges and suggestions like, you know, use text or concepts directly from the songs within the game text and things like that. So this Party Sucks at its conception was very distinctly based on the queer folk punk album Tempest in a Teacup by the artist Mal Blum. As in, I literally sat down on the floor of my room with my laptop and listened to the album, I think about 2.5 times while typing into a Google Doc. And that I built the whole original base text of the game in the length of 2.5 iterations of the album. Just every time a concept came up within the lyrics that I thought could translate well to a game mechanic or a descriptive moment, I added it in. And what I ended up with was a game where you essentially have 3 main scenes, which are each a party that sucks at least a little bit, where this protagonist who is anxious and tired and trying to distract themselves from a breakup tries to have a good social experience and fails at least a little. And scenes end, to close it, you think about your ex. When something in the setting reminds the protagonist of their ex, that's their sign that they're burning out at that party and it's not doing what they wanted to do for them anymore, and they get ready to leave. There's no dice. There's index cards, but like those are the only sort of cards and materials. I often use D4s as tokens because they're such nice little pointy shapes, but there's 3 tokens that represent your social energy at the party, and you have to spend a token to do things like reach out to a new person. Essentially, strong social energy spending or very emotionally healthy things cost you something. If you want to self-sabotage, you can kind of do that eternally because you're playing a character who's in a place where it's much easier for them to do that. And then the other thing about it that also came very directly from the text of the album that's also very intentional on my part is that at the end of the game, you do an epilogue. And all the epilogue moves are named after song titles or lyric elements from the album. And in the epilogue, you all answer a couple questions in character as the protagonist. But forward in the future, you're reflecting back on this moment in your life, and you are a bit more healed and a bit more grounded and okay. Maybe not perfect, maybe not amazing, but you're not in that particular shitty moment where you were trying to get over something that it was hard to get over and you were socially stressed and entangled. You get to look back and laugh a little bit. And so both for that character, you don't leave them just in a very shitty moment in their life, and for players, you don't leave yourselves emotionally kind of sitting in the soup of what may be like bringing up your own memories of personal awkwardnesses or things. You get to walk out a little bit and end in a slightly more grounded way. Because a lot of the folks I played this game with are folks who do fit the same demographics as the protagonist or who once did. And so a mechanic that got developed during the playtesting phase was, if you want, you can put a card on the table with a long abbreviation on it that stands for, "I feel called out, but please continue." And you tap that when things in the game remind you maybe a little, almost too much of stuff in your own life. And so you may be like wincing or laughing or having different physical or emotive reactions, but you're like, no, I don't want to stop. We don't need to take that out of the game. I'm just going like, oh God, I could have done that when I was 25, couldn't I? Oof. Please, I promise it's cool. It's just, this is poking a particular note that this game may really poke for you if you are a queer and or trans person playing it, which you don't have to be. But if you aren't and you play it, I didn't write it for you. It's fine if you play it, but I wasn't thinking of your logistical needs when I wrote it. So if it feels awkward, that's okay. Lean into it, experience it as you can. That's fine, but you're not the target demographic. You are just a welcome addition to the party if you decide you want to RP that experience for yourself, which some people do and many people absolutely don't. Common reactions I get to this game are, oh my God, I want to play that so bad, or I have a specific friend I want to show that to, and also, wow, I respect that as a concept and I super can't imagine playing that. And I'm like, yes, that's good. That's on purpose. It is a hyper-specific game. There are some beautiful systems out there that are intentionally general where you can play with a bunch of different themes and concepts and settings, and that is not what I set out to write. You play a very specific thing.
And that's okay. Like, not every
Yeah.
game has to be written for the straights. It's cool.
No,
It's
and also
fine.
like, not all our games need to be a specific fantasy or sci-fi or mundane setting or designed to be setting adaptable. Like some of my
Right.
favorite games are. Like I love Downfall, I love Microscope. I
Mhm.
love a lot of games where you enter with no setting and you get
Mhm.
to decide before you play what it's
Yeah.
going to be. But those take a different kind of energy and cognitive load, and they tell
Yeah.
different kinds of stories.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's nice to be like, yeah, you're like a 16th century sea captain. Like that's exactly what this game is about. Like we're
Right.
going into this. There's a lot of games I haven't played too, but that are just in my eternal PDF archive that are about really specific stuff.
Yeah.
And there's so many where I'm like, I haven't found a context yet to play this, but I hope I get one. I've seen one that I'm blanking on the name of, but where it's like a group LARP where you play students at like one of the first schools for the deaf in a
Huh.
region, and you build a collaborative language together in the way that students at that early school did,
Wow.
as part of the LARP experience. It's
Wow.
like written as a LARP that you can play to engage with a piece of disability justice history. And I'm like, that would take some setup, and I'd need to organize a group of people I trusted to like go into that concept in a thoughtful way. But damn, I'm glad it exists, I love when people write stuff that's hyper specific.
Yeah, I mean, you have the games that are like, this is a system or setting neutral thing and it can do everything. That's great. I mean, there's space for that. But I want the deep dive. I want to play like you created this to tell a specific kind of story, to have me have a specific kind of experience. And goddamn it, I want to have that experience.
Exactly.
So.
I enjoy that. And I've thought about trying to like system neutralize This Party Sucks, because I think you couldn't do everything with it, but I think I could pull a base form out of it that you could use to tell other stories about a stressed out, kind of out of place protagonist.
Mhm.
I think I could make a base form that someone could translate to that. And I have joked around with friends about that, because it's like, what would we call it? There's like games that are, descended from the Queen or powered by the apocalypse. It's like, would it be This System Sucks? Like, what would we, what would be the setting neutral, like base thing that I would have people credit if I actually pulled that together sometime? I don't know, but I would enjoy finding one.
What I find really interesting about this game is it's meant to tell a very specific and deeply emotional story.
Yeah.
But the main character is shared. Like you said, it's a character non-monogamous story. What drove you to that decision?
A lot of it, honestly, the really direct through line and thread is the fact that Downfall and A Place to Fuck Each Other both do it. And those are games that I love, and I've enjoyed the emotional experience of playing them. And part of why I think that works so well for both those games, and what I hoped it would do in my game, is that you get to be surprised by the main character. You get to be like involved with them and invested in them, and you like get a time to be them. But sometimes their story twists, or where they go emotionally, is not where you would have taken them if you were playing them the entire time. And I think especially for a character who is under stress and is in a complicated time in their life, that's very evocative. And also because I didn't want it to be a big ensemble cast kind of game. I didn't even want there to be like 3 key characters like Downfall has. I wanted it to be very focused on the feelings and tensions of one person, because that was so much the tonality of the album Tempest in a Teacup. It's a lot of internal stressed out monologues from one main narrator having these emotional experiences, and I wanted to lean into that. But if you only have one person getting to play that character, then the multiple players' experiences are more skewed. It would be more like either having a GM or having like one player with several GMs. And I didn't want that either. But A Place to Fuck Each Other really gave me a good template for it, because in any given scene in that, you've sort of got 2 players and 1 scene setter. You've got 2 people playing characters in the scene, and then 1 person plays the third, who represents all the factors in scenes that make what the 2 main characters want more complicated, that make it harder for them to like hook up or emotionally connect or engage with each other. So it can be your drunk friend who's calling you on the phone, or like the dog barking outside, or the errand you have to run, or the weather. The third's job is to insert those tensions and make the scene messier. And so I basically just flipped that, and instead of having 2 characters trying to be close to each other and 1 third creating a complicated factor, you have 1 protagonist trying to navigate a party, and then the other 2 players become the venue and other people. So they represent the social, personal factors and the spatial, logistical factors that are going to make the party suck.
Your games are extremely disparate You have games
Yes.
about being a selkie, you have games about being a sword, you have like,
Oh yeah, yeah. I have games about cooking dinner when you can't go shopping for ingredients, which became weirdly prescient this past year in a way that I did not expect or enjoy. But I did like that people have messaged me about it occasionally and gone, yeah, this game kind of lands differently now, but not in a bad way, because I really can't go out and get more groceries. Yeah.
if there's a common link to all these games, I would say that they're almost all told or created to tell deeply emotional or intimate stories.
Yeah. I
Why
like
is
my
that-
games feeling-y.
Why is that so important to you as a designer?
I think it honestly is it's the thing that drew me to like performance and creative work to begin with. Like a thing that I enjoyed before I'd gotten into RPGs, but I was starting to get into things that bordered it. Like my undergrad did humans versus zombies a lot, that sort of like large scale battle LARP across campus and things. I'd done events like that before, especially when the sort of zombie media craze was more going on. There was a very distinct memory I have of is back in my hometown area. At one point, the local bookstore did a zombie walk event to promote all the zombie literature they had in stock. So a bunch of people dressed up as zombies and sort of like slowly, wound their way through town, ending at the bookstore. And then there was an event. And I'm not a physically imposing person, really. I'm 5'4", and I was very short for my whole childhood, and only as an adult have hit a sort of vaguely average-ish height among peers. And so people they don't usually have like strong like startle or fear or dramatic responses to me. But for that zombie walk, I dressed up as a zombie. I didn't have very elaborate makeup. My cousin, who likes doing VFX makeup, did. She lent me fake blood, which I used liberally. And the thing that I did, which is mildly gruesome in retrospect, but I stand by it, I had one of those like baby dolls that has like hard plastic limbs and a soft central body, where when you sit it up, the eyes open, and when you lay it down, the eyes close. I made it a sort of grimy looking romper out of an old sock, and I smeared it with fake blood, and I carried it in my mouth down the street. And when we passed by random passerby who weren't in the march, I would dead eye stare them and then shake my head. So the doll flailed and the eyes would open and close and open and close, and people recoiled from me. And that was very gratifying to me to get to evoke a response via, like fairly opt-in theater. People would like come up to check out the zombies. I wasn't leaping out at them at random. But I got to like see this range of responses and experiences. And that's a lot of what I've loved in theater in general too, is like getting to evoke emotions with people and explore that. And so that's not the only thing I play RPGs for. I play lots of other RPGs for lots of other reasons. But if I'm sitting down to make one, if I have an idea that I'm excited about enough that it makes me want to follow through with it, it's usually because I thought of a feeling that I would enjoy experiencing creatively and collaboratively with others, and I want to see if I can write it down. For me, that's the core of why I write. Not all the ways that I game, but almost all the times that I make games, that's part of the point. I either have a feeling that I want to process, or a feeling that I'm having that I want to articulate in a different way, or something that's kind of tiring or frustrating. And I'm like, could I make this less tiring or frustrating by formatting it like a game? I have a game, as we noted, that's about when you can't go grocery shopping, but you need to make some food. And yeah, I'm a person with a range of executive dysfunction things that affect me at times. And also we're all living in a pandemic now. And also I've never owned a car. And I used to live on an island without a car. And I still had to get groceries. And it was a long and weird multi-step process. So partially with those, sometimes I'm just writing about something that I would love to have feel more like a game, so that I could still engage with it emotionally, but in a way that is a little like warmer and kinder to myself. Kind of the same deal with writing the ley line, my mini game that's essentially a form of guided daydreaming on public transit, because I've had a lot of long, weird public transit commutes.
Yeah, I'm sure. Living on an island. Yeah.
yeah. There was that. And there was also the time where I was like living in my home county of Sonoma, but doing a freelance project in San Francisco. And so twice a month, I would take a bus and then another bus and then the light rail and then another bus to go to the San Francisco LGBT Center and have meetings. And by the time that was done, the buses didn't run back in my hometown area anymore. So I would crash at a friend's place in Berkeley and go home the following day.
Oh my God.
That's also part of how I got into RPGs, frankly, because I listened to a lot of actual play podcasts during that summer where I was doing that freelance project. I listened to a lot of episodes of One Shot while I was writing the Bart.
Oh, yeah. It seems to me like gaming for you is it's more than just a leisure activity. It seems like it's almost like a form of self-therapy or healing.
It is. It's one of those things where it's like 100% can't and shouldn't replace therapy, but it's certainly informed by a lot of that. And some of my favorite comments and compliments that I've gotten on my games have related to that. I like my Selkie game, which is essentially about, and I'm pretty explicit about it, I'm like, this is about processing like an unsafe relationship and the fact that you now are able to leave, and are you physically and emotionally ready to do that? Like, that's what the game is about, because frankly, that's what a lot of Selkie lore is about anyway. And I'm far from the only game writer or writer in general who's drawn that thread. I've read some other like amazing Selkie game work on that front, but I've had people read some of my stuff and go, this is literally similar to like a mental exercise my therapist told me to do. I've gotten that response to As Soft as You Remember, my Selkie game, and I've also gotten that response to Roller Rink Redux, my game, which I wrote via a series of Twitter messages in order to keep myself from having a panic attack at a roller rink. I was just like having way too many sort of intense emotive memories of social ostracization at middle school parties, but I was an adult at a roller rink with friends. I'm like, I'm actually safe and fine. I'm just not good with this combo of not being very steady on roller skates, and also there's experimental metal playing because we're at an art event at the roller rink, and it feels like the roller rink itself is having a panic attack because of the noises that are happening. I'm going to sit down and go on Twitter. And what I ended up writing was essentially just like a guided thought exercise to going, hey, I'm okay. I'm not my middle school self anymore. I'm like a living, breathing, queer and trans adult with more friends and resources and connections and sense of the world than I had as a kid. And I can be in a space that reminds me of, or literally is a space that I was as a kid, and I will be okay. And like, that's the game. Like, the game is essentially just doing that. It's go to a place that reminds you of like your younger, like closeted or like scared to be out self, and just fucking exist there. Did you do that? Congratulations, you won the game.
That must feel so incredibly satisfying and powerful to be able to have people play those games and just relate to you on that level, because it's not a unique experience, unfortunately, you know, and to be able to say, hey, I made this to help myself, and now I hope it helps you too, and have people say, yes, it does.
It's really lovely. Like, it also, it gets me every time when I find out that someone that I have no direct connection to has played one of my games, because you don't always know, especially when you're a very small scale designer. People don't always think to tell you. It doesn't always happen. But like, I know at least one of my games got run at a convention that I wasn't at, and that blew my mind. You know, I don't know how often that's happened, probably not very many times, but the concept of it happening at all is still wild to me. And I love it every single time that someone tells me about one of my games. And I see people saying the same thing on Twitter, and I will just absolutely echo it. Like, tell small scale designers when you play their stuff, because holy shit, we love it. So seldom do we get direct feedback. It's so fantastic to know when people play our stuff. It makes such a difference, whether or not you have specific feedback, just knowing that you saw it, that you engaged with it at all. Because I know a lot of people have downloaded my stuff, but I myself have, you know, over 100 PDFs of games. I haven't played most of them. So I appreciate the aspirational love of downloading, but I know that it in no way translates to direct engagement, and I don't expect it to at all.
And you're really a holistic designer. I mean, from concept to the actual printing of the thing.
Yeah. Oh, let me pull some stuff that I have nearby. I have various prints of some of my games. But yeah, sorry, I cut you on the middle of the statement.
No, that's okay. Why? Was it something out of necessity? Like, what drove you to say, you know what, cradle to grave, I'm doing this whole game, everything?
Yeah, so part of that, I didn't actually talk about zines that much as a thread in my design story. So I love comics. I love a lot of different kinds of media. I love going to conventions because I am a deep extrovert. I love talking to strangers who I know I have at least a small shared interest with. That's like the dream. That's one of my favorite things to do. In more recent years, you know, pre-pandemic, I got really into volunteering at comic and game conventions because I love being the info booth voice. I will stand there and describe to you what indie RPGs are and how you can sign up for a live actual play all day. I will literally do it until my voice gives out, and I have, which is not a good idea, but I've done it. I need to drink more tea and be gentler with myself. But when I first started going to comic and game conventions, I had the thought that, like, I love drawing. I don't do it anywhere near as much currently, but I used to do a lot more visual art and a lot of little comics. And, you know, I'd put them on Tumblr whenever I could figure out, like during undergrad, if I could find a way to justify drawing a comic or an art piece for an assignment, I would do it. And at liberal arts school, you can often find a way to do that. So I drew quite a few comics for school projects. And before I went to a comic convention for the first time, I decided I'm going to make a zine, and that's going to be like my social business card. I can trade that with people for their business cards or art that they make, and then they can find me on Tumblr and I can find them, and I can engage more with other people who are making art. And so I designed a tiny zine about how being in a multi-generational activist street band as a high schooler helped me figure out stuff about my gender identity and how I wanted to engage with politics. And then I printed it at my work on their printer in the middle of the night, as you do, the classic way to make your inaugural zine. And I printed a bunch of those up, and I went to a comic convention, and I traded them with a bunch of people, and I had a blast. So I'd already gotten into making zines as a concept. And so then when I started getting into RPGs, the first like sort of official RPG I made was Market Magic, and it was for the 200-word RPG competition in 2018. And that was a challenge that a bunch of other people in game design in the Seattle area who I knew were doing at the same time. So we were riffing and sharing ideas. And I'm a super wordy person. It's not hard for me to get my ideas out in words. And so challenging myself to make a complete playable concept that was 200 words or less sounded like a good thing to push myself to do. And so I designed and formatted that. It's just a one-page sheet, one-sided. The original version of it, I drew just on a sheet of printer paper while I was at Geek Girl Con volunteering at an info booth. In between people coming to the info booth, I drafted the physical version of it. I'd already written the text, but I turned it into a zine. And then it just sort of spiraled from conventions. I already knew I liked that format of thing. And then I went to the Short Run Comics and Art Expo, which is an amazing small press event in Seattle that I miss dearly. And I hope to attend again when we have a safer way to do that again. But it was lots of people who did risograph printing, which was not something that I'd heard of barely at all. It's basically like just a specific kind of printer tech that originated in Japan. I forget if in the 70s or 80s. And it can print a few very specific colors, many of them gorgeously vivid. It does a fluorescent pink that you can't really print with other forms of printers. Just the ink does not exist in quite the same way. This like translucent, this like semi-opaque, like layerable fluorescent pink. And it prints only one color at a time. So you get offset issues sometimes if you're layering things, but you can also lean into that as a design element. And a lot of people doing like interesting small press art zines in the Seattle area, at least, use Riso. So I went to this event and I was seeing and buying and trading for these really beautiful zines. And I was like, what is this? I need to know what this is. And there was a booth from a local print studio called Paper Press Punch that is primarily risograph. And they said, yeah, we do all kinds of this stuff. And we have open studio hours. You can come take our workshop and get trained to use the Riso printers. And then you can book time to come in and print on our machines and only pay for like the material costs. So it's way cheaper than getting them to print stuff for you. And I was like, that sounds fucking excellent. And I already have a zine. So I reformatted it as a dual color Riso print. And that was my first risograph project. And then I fell in love. And so now most of my games, I also do risograph prints of. Some of them are zines. I do lots of one-pagers, but I also do things like I Need Your Strongest Potions. I wrote for the Not a Game Jam, which was based on some indie designers getting hassled on Twitter about the concept that their games weren't really games because it's just a PDF. What is that? Which misses a lot of points. But so it's a game that it fits on a postcard, and I did all the formatting in Canva and then just printed it, single color on fun colors of paper. And it's literally just a description of the fact that you should probably be hydrated. But I formatted it as though you were a potion seller. you're talking to the potion seller because you need a strong potion to face the many challenges. But your challenges could be things like the heat or the toiling day or a social space or the path to sleep. And so the potion seller might recommend you things like electrolytes or smoothies or mocktails or herbal tea, depending on what kind of challenge you are facing and what kind of hydration would help you with that. But I love Riso. I feel like it's quirky, it's weird, it's a pretty environmentally friendly print medium. It's soy-based inks. It's kind of like a weirdly charming small scale print thing. It makes me feel socially connected to a lot of like art and poetry and like zine creative spaces that aren't all tabletop game focused, but that I think can really gain a lot from conversations with tabletop game zine designers, because we all enjoy layout in our various ways. And there's a scrappiness to Riso, the fact that a little bit of smudge and mess and color layer offset can be sometimes expected in the process, that I also love, because so much of the history of zines lies in like DIY punk scene, you know, break into your office after hours and do it on their Xerox kind of vibes. And so I feel like even if you're trying to make something a little more artsy and intentional and finessed, Riso calls to that lineage and embraces that smudginess and that looseness that I think is a good reminder to have in the zine scene. That, you know, beautiful produced little art books on glossy paper are also great, and I've bought some of those in my time, but that I want my zines to be things, even if I make them fancily, that I could probably also do in secret on a Xerox.
I think there's a beauty to the imperfection. You know, it's like the wabi-sabi, you know, fixing the broken vase with the gold leaf, that kind of idea. Yeah, that's awesome.
And that's part of, especially because I'm a very high anxiety person and I can be a perfectionist. It's good to remember that like the perfect can really be the enemy of the good, and that the thing that you finish is always going to be better than the idea that never makes it to paper because you're scared to figure out how to actualize it.
That's an important lesson for a lot of designers.
It is. I can't claim I always live by it, but when I do, it's great. I love when I'm like, cool, I slap this formatting together in Canva and I'm going to download those files and I'm going to, you know, tuck my laptop in my backpack and take 2 buses to Georgetown and just slap this thing through on the Riso. And if it didn't come out like I thought it was gonna, you know what? It still exists. Like writing the ley line super doesn't look like I wanted it to look, but I still printed it and have fun printing it. And the front and back covers are smudgy, but you can still read the text. So it works. And maybe I'll redo it at some point, because my vision for it was I wanted, when it was folded, for it to look on the front and back kind of like a bus pass.
Okay.
But the like thickness and intensity of the ink on Riso for it smudged out a little bit more than I wanted it to. I was trying to do very solid color on a large space, and I don't think I set the actual intensity of the color blocks to match what I wanted it to look like in print. But I love the concept, and I'm probably going to fuss with it more in future, because a bus daydream game that looks like a bus pass, I do enjoy that. I want to work on that more. Instead, it now looks more like a weird flyer you find on the floor of the bus station, but I'm kind of okay with that too.
It's all the aesthetic. It all fits so well. It's fine. So you were saying the limiting factor of the 200-word game jam was something really, really inspired you. Is that what further pushed you into the business card jam?
It is. That was definitely a thread through that. And the business card game jam, I had a blast. I ran that with my friends and occasional co-designers, Star and Nick. And with that, I think it was an idea that Star had on a plane, because he was thinking about how at game conventions, people exchange business cards so much, but often nothing happens with those. You know, you lose them, they get scrunched in the bottom of your bag, you don't sort through them, you don't follow up with people. They're not a very lively object, even though we exchange them a lot. And so he was thinking about, like, wouldn't it be so cool from a design perspective if your business card as a game designer was itself a little game? Wouldn't that be like a neat way to really engage richly with what you do and to make it a funner thing to trade? And so he voiced that, and his wife said, bet you can't. And he said, bet I can. And then he did. And she was like, wow, I knew you would, but I didn't think you'd do it that fast. Like, I knew if I bet you, you would, but you really went for that, huh? And so essentially the three of us decided that we wanted to do a mini game jam, the three of us, and just play with that concept of making games that fit on business cards. So we all got together and had tea and snacks and, you know, cut a bunch of paper into little business card sizes and riffed on ideas. And we all made 1 or 2 things. And then the 2 guys were like, oh, you know, this is fun. Like, it would be neat if this was a bigger game jam, but I don't know how to do that. And I was like, I think it's pretty easy. itch.io has a whole format for it. here, bet you I can set it up right now. And they were like, and I was like, just give me a minute. And I made the header in Canva and I set up the jam page and then I turned it around. I was like, cool, I can set it live in a second. We want to do that. I picked a hashtag. Does this make sense? And they went, I guess we're running a game jam.
Wow.
And then we did. And then it kind of blew up on game design Twitter a little bit, which was what I was hoping for, because I knew that if just the idea got out there, because it was an idea to make a very small thing, we weren't asking people for a big commitment. We were asking them to engage with, just produce a very small idea, share it as you can. And so we got over 80 entries and none of them were similar to the others. They're all over the place. There's ones about like ghosts and remembering people you're lost or aren't near. There's ones that are fitting like a whole set of dungeon mechanics or detailed stuff into like little stat tables on a card. There's ones that are very like ethereal and high concept. There's horny ones, like, you know, there's ones that are like, hey, you know, like this is about how like a vampire feeds on a willing blood source and the social intimacies of that. You know, like there's a lot of different vibes to what people put into Business Card Jam, and it was delightful. It was weird and delightful because people did so many things that wouldn't have occurred to us, and that was 100% the goal, because creative limits help. You can get really stuck when concepts are bigger than you can chew on. And I really like doing that kind of setup for myself. And that's a lot of why I enjoy zines so much too. I'm like, I have one side of one 8.5 by 11 sheet. That's all I've got. And I could technically fit a lot on it, but will it be legible and smooth and comfy to read? So in fact, I have less. You know, there are margins, there are edges, there are scale factors. And I like that. I think I write better when I am thinking about that.
The constraints are they force you to think certain ways or consider certain things that you wouldn't otherwise if you had like, oh, this is a notebook, fill it with your ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I can put any number of bad ideas in this, but if I have a very small space, I need to make sure they are worth putting on here.
Yeah, it helps me, you know, it helps with like the terror of the blank page. I like having things scaled down, and I like having prompts. That's part of why I love game jams so much. I love game jams. I love things that create deadlines for me, because it's hard to create them on my own. If something is collaborative and it has a deadline, then I will do it. If it is solo and it does not have a deadline, it is totally up in the air if I will actually do it or not. But if I can commit to it with other people or have a specific time frame, then it is much more likely to happen. And so collaborations with friends are amazing for that. Game jams are amazing for that. I also often have used conventions as deadlines for a game. I'm like, I need to get this designed in time to get it reso printed and cut by the time I go to the convention, so I can have copies of it in my backpack to trade with people. And then I make the game, you know? Or if I had it made but not formatted for print, I format it for print because now I have a deadline.
So beyond game design in your day job, you're an educator as well.
I am. Yeah, I do. It's sort of, because of the pandemic, my role has shifted several times. So I was originally hired for like pre-K kindergarten after school care. What I do now is a combo of, I've worked with after school care in different grades. Now I'm primarily with the older grades. And I also have done a lot of tech support for my coworkers, because we've all had to do a lot more things with tech than we did in the past. And I've also kind of become a part-time bonus TA. So I did get a raise, and I did get a raise in more hours and things, because we all had to step up in a lot of different ways working in education in this sphere. But yeah, I have worked with pretty much, like, I've worked with most of the grades and age ranges between preschool and 5th in various formats. I have run field trips and done a lot of outdoor education programming. I've done lots of like after school care and supervision. And I've also done like volunteer events and things where I've worked with and engaged with kids. For a while, I did a lot of running one-shot RPGs for middle school age Girl Scouts. That's one of my favorite volunteer projects I've ever done.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have 2 little kids, and I love playing role-playing games with them because they don't have any constraints about or expectations about what they have to do in a certain game. They come up with the wildest things.
It's good. I feel like one of my experiences, especially working with middle schoolers running RPGs, was certainly not true of all of them because nothing's universal, but often I found them to be amazingly generous players with each other in ways that adults aren't always, because I feel like sometimes adults can get cagey or precious with our ideas. Like we have a vision of where we want the story to go, and we're trying to tilt the narrative towards it. And different game systems work in different ways to try to balance that or engage with the fact that sometimes that's where people go emotionally. They might be building expectations into where the game is going to go that the game cannot guarantee, especially in like a GM-less collaborative thing where you kind of need to trade and share off directionality and narrative control. But I love sharing narrative control with like 5th graders because they go wild when you tell them that they have basically any narrative power on their turn, but everyone else has equal narrative power on their own turn. Microscope is great for that because they can create or destroy almost anything. And they kind of almost don't believe me sometimes when I say that they can. And I'm like, yeah, you can blow up a planet on your turn if you want. You know why? Because we are playing non-linearly across this whole big arc of time. So if we really love that planet, someone else can always choose to hop back to before you exploded it and learn more about it and explore and be there too. So like your actions will have consequences, but for the world, but they won't prevent anyone else from doing the thing they most want to do in the world. So you can really go wild on your turn if you want to. And usually what happens with that is I get a sort of like testing the power limits burst where they do really dramatic stuff for a few turns to see if I'm actually going to let them, and that's okay. And I'm like, as long as we're like agreeing to like the social rules we had with each other and we're not being cruel to each other and we're like creating the game together, then yeah, you can take this story where you're excited to go. And then the second half of the game will become more emotive melodrama as they realize, oh, I don't want to explode everything. I've gotten really invested in this world. And that's how I've played multi-generational sci-fi epics with middle school Girl Scouts twice, because I think I used the blowing up a planet example as a thing they could do because Ben Robbins uses that as an example in the text of Microscope to represent narrative power. Twice we've told stories of like interplanetary warfare that start out very dramatic and militaristic, and then in the second half they zoom in on the social and emotive impacts of the people and the characters and narratives that they've gotten into. One time it was like a young girl had been frozen in cryo sleep on like one of the early military ships, and like her cryo sleep pod crashed on a planet and she woke up generations into the war and tried to figure out like what side was the side that her foster mom had been running originally, so that she could like be on the side of the conflict that her family would have fought on if she'd been alive at the same time. And she manages to pick the wrong side because there'd been a mutiny between her mother and her mother's like first in command shortly after she was cryo frozen, and the details are lost to history. And she doesn't find this out until like right before she dies in battle. They went places with it.
Wow.
5th graders, like I would read that multi-series like sci-fi epic, you know? And another time a different group built a planet-sized war AI that was like designed to explode other planets, and then eventually decided that because it had sentience and agency, it didn't actually want to be a tool of war anymore, went dormant for generations, and then woke up again and formed a found family with other rebel AI that had been built for military purposes, but in entirely different forms, like tiny surveillance drones and sentient ships and things. And then this robot the size of a moon. It was amazing. I love the stories kids tell because they don't have big genre constraints. They don't have big narrative constraints. They don't feel a need to have like a distinct hero's journey arc or 3-act structure a lot of the time. And they get really excited in ways that I think a lot of adults in the RPG scene can, because we're cultivating that for ourselves. But sometimes some of us have had to work back to that after some blocks in the past. And gratefully, some kids are not having to do that full loop. They're just there in the enthusiasm. And especially, and Microscope really helped teach me this. I ended up writing one of my culminating essays for my Masters of Education program about this. I think especially a lot of GM-less games and the ways that they help you share narrative agency and control and build things collaboratively can be really cool tools to use with kids to help talk to them about power and agency and how to communicate their needs and their ideas and their desires with other people, including adults and people they think of as authority figures. Because the public school system, the school systems in general, public and private in the US in particular, I'm sure in other regions too, but I can mainly speak to my own experience, do not support kids in knowing how to do that. And in fact, sometimes actively punish that. And I'm honestly, especially during the course of the pandemic, I'm increasingly becoming an educator who is learning about concepts like school abolition and like building in whole things like, what would it look like if we truly genuinely dismantled this system and thought about structures of learning and education that look nothing like what schools are now. Like, I think schools are more reformable than, say, police. That's a much clearer, just 100% abolish point for me. But, I think school abolition honestly rolls really well with a lot of the things that I've learned about how learning works. and how I think about it socially and ethically, and what I see kids respond to with genuine joy and engagement and collaborative energy with me and with their peers.
I work at a university.
Yeah.
And my master's degree is in education as well.
Yeah.
So I'm right there with you.
Yeah,
And
I feel like when you've really slogged through it a bunch, you can do such rich critique of your own field.
Oh, it's delicious.
It's so tasty. I love getting to do that with other folks too. One of my favorite classes in my grad program was called Classroom Discourse, and it was about the ways that communication and learning and structure work in classrooms and learning spaces. And we talked a lot about RPGs. Because I wasn't the only person there with an RPG background, and we saw a lot of parallels, and essentially like a lot of classroom management tools are essentially teaching kids a rule set or a game or an opt-in structure that doesn't exist otherwise in order to help them format or understand or engage with the space. And when it comes right down to that, there is no clear line between that and LARPing or role playing. We're all playing roles in the school day that we've learned. Our just sense of how much they connect to reality and what the consequences are for not playing them are different than in intentional collaborative opt-in games. But yeah, that professor was my like reader and reviewer for one of my master's program essays. And I wrote it essentially about like power and discourse in the classroom. And I wrote it pointed sort of towards other educators. I'm like, hey, you probably don't know what an RPG is. So I'm going to do some baseline stuff about that to give you enough tools to understand what I'm going to say about GM-less game mechanics, because I think some of them could help you think about how to demystify power and control in the classroom. Because you can't pretend it doesn't exist. If you just go, oh, like we're all teachers, we're all students. That's lovely to say, but we're still embedded within these larger systems. That won't inherently change how the classroom works, especially because you're still probably literally the teacher and you have power over the kids. You are bigger, you know more, you can literally control how they're allowed to move. You can give them, social or like grade-based punishments, and you are literally ranking and rating things about them. So if you're still doing that, there's still power. Don't pretend it's not there, but admit it's there, talk about it, chip away at it in the ways that you can, and give kids safe formats that you help them understand and practice for learning how to talk about when a system of power doesn't feel good, is unjust, doesn't make sense, isn't clear, isn't fitting their needs. And a lot of RPGs genuinely help with that, because that's a lot of how you design a game system and how you create the social rules of engagement for a specific session. You're like, hey, what are the topics we are and aren't going to cover? Let's make a yes-no palette. Like, let's talk about our social and bodily norms. Like, anyone can leave the table for any reason. You don't have to explain it to us. We will take intentional bio breaks. Like, let us know what you need for your body. Let us know what you need emotionally. Let's talk about the different tools we can use to make this a fun experience, because we're here intentionally to play a game together. And if what we're doing isn't serving that, then why are we doing it? Because we, the human beings, are still always going to be more important than whatever abstract narrative we're trying to build together. And in the classroom, in theory, the classroom is/should be all in service of learning. In practice, that's not even literally what it is. It's a lot to train people how to like be comfortable with existing social systems of authority. And especially the US public school system very literally was built in part to train people how to do factory work. I used to think that was more a secret than it was. It's not even a secret. Like, we know that's a thing. It's not speculative, but it still surprises people who aren't in education, or who are in education sometimes. And so it's like, what do you want the classroom to actually be in service of? And are the structures and the rules, or the lacks of rules that you're creating, actually in service of that? Because structure isn't bad, but if you're not intentional with it, or if you assume it will do something because of your aspirations, when that's not what it's doing in practice, it helps to reevaluate. And on a certain level, I don't think that's a distinct skill set from game design. You play test, you figure out what's working in the classroom, and if it is not serving what you actually want to happen for you and for your students, then you reformat. And if you teach them to be able to be agents in that, and you treat them as actual agents in that, where you listen to and incorporate their needs and ideas, then they will become more practiced at how to voice that to you and how to be good play testers for their educational experience.
I have like 1,000 more questions and ideas I want to talk with you about this, but we're coming up on the hour now, and I want to be sensitive to your time. I want to talk about intentionality with design, classroom space as well, but
there's so many. I mean, I'm on the internet. We can certainly follow up on this in other forms too, and I would love that.
Absolutely. Before we go, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you really just have a deep desire to discuss?
Honestly, we covered a lot of the things that I most enjoy talking about because I'm pretty good at talking about the things that I really enjoy talking about, and you guided things in very useful ways too. But yeah, we've talked about zines, we've talked about how games interface with education, we've talked about queerness and transness in the nature of how I design games and who my audience is. We've talked about non-standard forms of getting into RPGs. You know, I have played the classic Dragon game, but it is not how I grew to love RPGs, and it has never been central to my experience of them. And I think that definitely creates some social and structural differences to how I learned to write games that can be entertaining to run into in various design conversations. And yeah, I'm really delighted, and it's been really fun to talk to you about this. And it's also it's very deeply fun to get to just pour out my brain towards other designers who have education backgrounds, because so many of these are ideas that, like, I know there's so much more we could talk about and so much more we could do with that. And, you know, if you want to brainstorm and turn it into a zine sometime, that's the kind of thing that I do. So yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This has been an absolute joy, and I hope you come back on the show soon.
I would love that. I would love, to figure out more ideas or to come pick your brain again. I did a lot of direct talking and describing my stuff because I can kind of roll forever if I'm allowed to do that. But now I want to get into more of a back and forth sometime about like educational theory in games.
Absolutely.
I think that would be real tasty.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time, and you've been a complete joy.
Thanks.
Hey, folks, it's Nate. Once again, a big thank you to Moss for coming on the show. They are absolutely one of my favorite designers. And if you haven't checked them out yet and their works, follow the link in the show notes to their itch.io page, because Moss just comes out with some of the most amazing games. We could have gone on for so much longer talking about all my favorite stuff, but I try to stick to an hour because, well, I want to have them back to talk about more amazing stuff. And hopefully I will soon. If you want to show Moss some love, make sure that you go on their itch.io page, as I said before. Find them on Twitter and just invite them to all your cool parties and talk to them and tell them how much they rock, because it's true, and people need to hear that once in a while, you know? And Moss deserves it, goddammit. If you want to support the Pot of Blunders, as always, go to our patreon.com/potofblunders page. That's how people say that when they do normal outros. Yeah, I'm sticking with it. So help us keep the lights on, help us keep bringing you more amazing interviews and actual plays of indie games and the designers. And hey, you know what? Get yourself something special too. Not too crazy, we got bills coming up, but treat yourself, you know? You've earned it. For the Pot of Blunders, I've been Nate Magnuski, and as always, may all your D's be 12s.